She had not hesitated. That was the thing she would turn over and over in the months that followed, not with regret, but with a kind of exhausted wonder at herself. She had not hesitated at all. The fire had been burning for an hour when the Duchess pressed the document into her hands. The study was warm, close, smelling of the Duke's old tobacco and the beeswax that the housemaids used on the bookshelves every Thursday. Nell had stood with the folded paper between her fingers and looked at the woman in front of her, the woman she had served for 3 years, whose letters she had written, whose secrets she had kept with the same care she gave to her own, and she had seen in the Duchess's face something she had never seen there before. Not fear, worse than fear, the look of a person who has run out of time to be brave. So Nell had turned to the fire. She had held the document over the grate for the length of one breath. The paper had caught at one corner first, a small, bright tooth of flame working inward, and she had held it until the heat reached her fingers, and then she had let it fall. It was gone in 9 seconds. She had counted. And then a voice came from the doorway behind her, dry and unhurried, the voice of a man who had been watching and had been waiting for exactly this. Baron Lucien Frey stepped into the firelight. He looked at the grate. He looked at Nell's hands. He looked at the Duchess with an expression that was not anger. It was satisfaction, which was far worse, and he said the thing he had prepared to say, that she had destroyed evidence, that the document she had burned belonged to the crown, that he had witnesses, or would have them by morning, and that she would answer for it before she left the house. The Duchess said nothing. Nell looked at her. One look, direct and clear, the look of a woman waiting for the person she had just protected to speak. The Duchess looked at the fire. The constable arrived inside the hour. Nell was taken from the house in the cold November dark with her hands at her sides and her back straight, and the ink stain on her right index finger, the only mark on her that she had put there herself. She did not weep. She had already calculated, somewhere between the grate and the front door, that weeping would cost her more than it would give. The dungeon below Verna Castle was cold in the way that old stone is cold, a cold that does not fluctuate because it has nothing to do with the weather. It simply is. Nell sat in it, on a bench that had been bolted to the wall sometime in the previous century, and looked at the small rectangle of gray sky above the grate in the ceiling, and thought, this is where we find her. This is where the story begins to open up. Because the most important things about a person are not visible in their comfort. They are visible here in the cold and the dark, with everything taken and nothing left but what was always there. Before we continue, take a moment to support Dreamswalkers. If you're enjoying the story, give this video a like, subscribe to the Dreamswalkers, and let me know in the comments where you're watching from. I'd love to see how far this Regency story reaches and how many people it connects across the world. Drop your country or city in the comments below, and let's see just how far this journey travels. I put a new story here every week, and I would love for you to stay. Now, let me take you back to before the fire and show you exactly who Nell Ashby is. The Verne household had been Nell's entire world for 3 years, which was long enough to know it the way you know a piece of music you have played so often your hands find the notes before your mind has decided to reach for them. She had come to it at 22, the daughter of a clergyman from Derbyshire who had left her 3 things when he died: a thorough education, a habit of rising before the household, and no money whatsoever. The position as the Duchess's companion had come through the same network of clerical connections that governed most things in the lives of women in her position. A letter from a bishop's wife to a countess's secretary, to to the Duchess's housekeeper, a chain of female recommendation that moved through drawing rooms and vestries and morning calls without any man knowing it existed or thinking to oversee it. The Duchess of Verne had interviewed Nell for 11 minutes and then offered her the position at the end of them, which Nell had later worked out was a shorter interview than the Duchess had given anyone for any role in the household, including the cook. She had not known at the time what this meant. She had come to understand that it meant the Duchess had seen what she needed to see in 11 minutes and did not believe in wasting time once she had her answer. What the Duchess had seen, Nell supposed, was the same thing everyone eventually saw, that she remembered everything, not as a trick or a performance, simply as the way her mind worked, the way some minds are built for numbers and others for music, and hers had always been built for text. She read a letter once and held it whole. She had a conversation and could reproduce it, weeks later, word for word, with the cadence and the pauses intact. The Duchess's correspondence was voluminous and often sensitive and required someone who could be trusted absolutely with what passed through her hands. And Nell had been trusted absolutely from the second week onward, because she had demonstrated once that she could recall verbatim a letter the Duchess had been unable to find, had dictated it back from memory with the date and the salutation and the crossed-out line in the third paragraph. And the Duchess had looked at her afterward with the expression of a woman who has found exactly the tool she needed and intends to keep it. Nell had not minded being a tool. She had minded occasionally being only that, but she had kept that thought in the place where she kept things that were true and not useful, and she had done her work. The work was correspondence. The Duchess wrote a great many letters and received more, and Nell managed the filing and the drafting and the copying with the quiet efficiency of a woman who has learned to make herself invisible in the act of working. She knew more about the internal life of the Verne household and about the wider world of people connected to it than anyone in the building except perhaps the Duchess herself, because information poured through her hands every day and she held all of it. She had also, over 3 years, come to know the Duke. The Duke of Verne had been 61 when Nell arrived, and already not well, though he had managed the fact of his declining health with the same bone-deep self-possession he brought to everything else. He was a man who had lived very long in his own skin and was thoroughly at home there. He had the manner of someone who had spent decades watching people perform for him and had long since lost interest in the performance, and who found the absence of it in the stable hand, in the kitchen maid, in his wife's young correspondence secretary, a form of refreshment. He had spoken to Nell perhaps a dozen times in 3 years. Each time he had asked her a direct question and listened to the answer with an attention that made her feel, for the duration of it, that she was the only person in the room. He had asked once what she thought of a particular pamphlet on agricultural reform that had been circulating through the county. She had told him. He had disagreed with 2 of her points, conceded one, and walked away looking faintly pleased, which the footman later told her was as close as the Duke came to expressing delight. He had died in September, 3 weeks before the story I am telling you begins. He died the way he had lived, without making more of it than necessary, in his own bed on a Tuesday morning, with the autumn light coming through the curtains he had insisted on keeping open. The household had grieved him, in the manner of people who genuinely liked their employer and had not been looking forward to the change that would follow. The change arrived in the form of Baron Lucien Frey. Frey had been appointed administrator of the Verne estate in the absence of a direct male heir. The Duke had no sons, and the title passed to a distant cousin in Scotland who was 16 years old and presently at school and entirely unaware that anything significant had happened. Frey's appointment had come through a legal instrument that the Duke had signed 4 years prior, in a period of ill health that had since resolved, and which he had apparently never gotten around to revising. This had struck Nell as the kind of administrative oversight that tidy men do not generally make, but she had been a correspondence secretary, not a solicitor, and she had kept the observation in the place where she kept things that were true and not yet useful. Frey was 47. He dressed beautifully and spoke with the measured warmth of a man who had learned that warmth, deployed correctly, was more effective than force. He arrived at Verne Hall 2 days after the funeral with a team of solicitors and the quiet, comprehensive efficiency of someone who had been preparing for this moment and saw no reason to delay it further. He went through the Duke's papers in the study over 3 days. Nell had been in and out of the study during those 3 days, collecting documents that the Duchess needed and returning ones that had been misfiled, and she had watched Frey work with the same attention she brought to everything. He was looking for something. She could see it in the way he moved through the files, not randomly but with a method, checking and rechecking certain categories, returning to certain folders more than once. She had not known what he was looking for. She had known he was looking. On the evening of the 3rd day, she had been replacing a ledger on the shelf nearest the window when she heard the drawer open. Not the drawers she had seen him work through before. The locked drawer in the lower left of the Duke's desk. The one that had a different key from the others, which the Duchess kept on a chain around her neck. It had been opened. Nell did not turn around immediately. She placed the ledger on its shelf and aligned it with the ones beside it, and turned with the unhurried movement of a woman who is doing her work and nothing else. Frey was reading. His face had the expression of a man who has found what he came for. Not surprised, confirmed. He looked up when she moved, and the expression smoothed over instantly into something neutral, and they looked at each other across the study for a moment, and Nell went out. She went directly to the Duchess. The Duchess was in her sitting room, and when Nell came in and closed the door and told her what she had seen, the Duchess went very still. Not the stillness of surprise, the stillness of a woman receiving news she had been dreading for 20 years and had hoped, in the way you hope for things you do not believe in, would never arrive. She told Nell about the will. She told it sitting very straight in her chair, with her hands folded in her lap, looking at the fireplace, in the even voice of a woman reciting something she has rehearsed for a very long time. 21 years earlier, before her marriage to the Duke, she had been briefly and disastrously in love with a man her family had refused. The affair had produced a daughter who had been given to a respectable family in the north under circumstances that the Duchess had managed with the help of the Duke, who had known about the child and had married her regardless, and who had loved her, she believed, better for it. The Duke had included the daughter in his private will as a legitimate heir to a portion of the Verne estate, not the title, which was entailed differently, but a substantial property in Northumberland and the income attached to it. He had done this without telling the Duchess, who had discovered it only now, 3 years into her time at the house, when the locked drawer was apparently no longer locked. If Frey used the will publicly, the daughter's existence would become known. The Duchess's disgrace would be complete and irreversible. The daughter herself, now a young woman of 21, living quietly in Yorkshire and entirely unaware of any of this, would be pulled into a scandal not of her making. But if the will was suppressed, the girl lost her inheritance. Nell had sat with this for the length of time it took the fire to settle in the grate. Then she asked the question she needed to ask. She asked whether the Duke had loved the daughter, or whether the bequest had been a legal arrangement made without feeling. The Duchess looked at her for the first time since she had begun speaking. Something moved across her face. She said the Duke had met the girl once, at a distance, through an arrangement he had made with the family. She said he had come home from that meeting, and sat very quietly at dinner and had not talked for the rest of the evening, and that she had known, from the way he sat and did not talk, that he had been moved by what he saw. Nell looked at the fire. She thought about a man of 61 who had gone to look at a daughter who did not know he existed and had come home and sat in silence with what he had found there. She thought about the locked drawer and the key on the Duchess's chain and the document that had been meant to give the girl something, and the man who had now found it and was about to use it for something else entirely. She asked the Duchess what she wanted her to do. The Duchess pressed her hands together in her lap. Her voice, when it came, was barely above the level of the fire. She said she needed the will to disappear. Nell stood up. She looked at the Duchess once more. Then she went to the study. The dungeon had 2 cells, of which Nell occupied one, and a man who had been caught stealing from the kitchen occupied the other. He had introduced himself on the first morning as Thomas, had offered to share his bread, and had asked no questions, which she had found more decent than most of what had been offered to her in the previous 48 hours. She had been there 4 days before anyone came who mattered. The days had a shape of a kind. The gray light through the grate moved across the floor as the sun moved. Meals arrived twice. The cold was constant and required management. She had arranged her coat over her shoulders in the way that preserved the most warmth, and she had found that if she moved for 20 minutes every 2 hours, the numbness in her feet did not become pain. She had slept poorly and thought well, which was not how she would have chosen it, but was at least an arrangement she could work with. She thought about the will. She thought about what she knew and what she had destroyed and what the difference between those 2 things was. She thought about the Duke's letter, which had been in the small box of her personal belongings taken from her room the morning of her arrest. And she thought about it in the way she thought about everything she had ever read, completely, precisely, word by word. She had read it as a kindness. She was reading it differently now. He had written it 3 weeks before his death. She had received it the day after the funeral, delivered to her by the housekeeper with a small stack of similar notes to household staff, and she had read it once and kept it and not thought about it again, because grief has a way of flattening everything around it for a time. He had thanked her for her service. He had said she had a gift for correspondence that deserved a wider scope than a duchess's sitting room. He had said he trusted her memory above all things. And then he had written a sentence about the view from the east window of the library in Edinburgh, which had struck her as curious at the time, a non sequitur in an otherwise purposeful letter, and which she had set aside as the wandering of an unwell man putting his affairs in order. It was not a non sequitur. She could see that now, sitting in the cold, with nothing but her own mind to work with. It was a location. It was a name. It was the address, encoded in a sentence about a view, of exactly where the second proof lived. She had not told anyone this. She had not told anyone because she had not been given the chance to tell anyone, and because the one person she might have told was the person whose silence had put her here, and she was not yet sure what to do with that particular weight. On the 5th morning, a different set of footsteps came down the stone stairs. She heard them before she saw their owner, unhurried even, the tread of a man who is going somewhere with a purpose and sees no need to announce it. He came around the corner and stopped outside her cell and looked at her with the assessing attention of someone who has heard a story and has come to see whether the person in front of him matches it. He was tall, dark-coated, somewhere in his middle 30s, with a face that had clearly decided against being handsome in favor of being useful. He had the look of a man who had spent a significant portion of his life paying close attention to things other people had not bothered to examine, and who had found this habit worth the trouble. He looked at her for a long moment without speaking, which she did not find uncomfortable because she was doing the same thing. Then he told her his name: Callum Ashford, Duke of Strome. He had known the Duke of Verne for 20 years. He did not believe Baron Frey's account of events. He was there to hear hers. She looked at the iron bars between them and back at his face, and made the calculation she had been making since the cell door closed: who could be trusted and what trust would cost, and she decided, not from hope, but from the logic of her own position, that she had nothing left to lose by telling the truth to a man who had come to hear it. She told him everything, not quickly, not in the order that feeling would have arranged it, but in the order that was useful: what Frey had found, what the Duchess had asked, what she had done, and why, and what she had understood about the Duke's letter in the 4 days since. He listened without interrupting. He stood at the bars with his arms at his sides, and he listened the way the Duke had once listened to her, as though what she was saying was the only thing happening in the room. When she finished, the cell was quiet for a moment. He asked one question. He asked whether she still had the letter. She told him it had been taken with her other belongings at the time of her arrest. He nodded once. He looked at the floor between them, at the cold stone, at the particular nothing that lies between one person and another when there is iron in the way, and she saw him turning something over, running it through whatever internal process he used to determine what was true. Then he looked up. He did not make promises. She noticed this and was grateful for it, because promises from powerful men in dungeons cost them nothing and meant less. He simply said he would be back. He was. He came back the following morning with a different expression, not the assessing look of the first visit, but something that had moved past assessment into a territory she did not yet have a name for. He came to the bars and held up the letter. She recognized it from 3 feet away. The Duke's handwriting on the folded paper, her name above the seal. He had found it in the box of her confiscated belongings, he told her, after a conversation with the constable that had taken longer than it should have, and cost him more patience than he generally allocated. He had read it. He had read it twice. He wanted her to tell him about the sentence regarding Edinburgh. She told him. She watched his face as she did. She watched the moment when the sentence resolved itself from its cover into its meaning, watched it land behind his eyes the way a key turns in a lock, clean and complete, and she saw him sit with it for a moment in the way of a man who has been handed something significant and is taking it seriously. He left within the hour. She did not know where he was going. She went back to the bench and the gray light through the grate and the sound of Thomas in the next cell eating his morning bread. And she waited. Now I want to stop here with you for a moment, because I think you already feel what Nell is carrying. Not just the cold and the injustice of where she is. Something older and heavier than that. She protected someone who did not protect her back. She kept a secret for a woman who let her be taken away in the dark without a word. And she is sitting in a dungeon with her ink-stained finger and her extraordinary memory and absolutely nothing else, waiting to find out whether the man who came to hear her story will do what men have so rarely done in her experience: follow through. Whatever you are carrying tonight, I hope you know the difference between the people who listen and the people who act. This is a story about both. Let us go back in. Callum went to Edinburgh. He went on the morning coach, which he had not taken since before his inheritance had made such economies unnecessary, and he sat in the corner of it for 2 days with the Duke's letter on his knee, and thought about a woman in a cold cell who had burned a fortune without hesitating, and had apparently done it because someone she trusted had asked her to. He had believed, when Frey first made his accusation publicly, that the case was a simple one. A servant with access to valuable documents, a moment of opportunistic destruction, a story about loyalty constructed after the fact to mitigate the consequence. He had believed this for approximately 3 hours, until the details had begun to accumulate into a shape that did not fit. The first detail was Nell herself. He had known, from 20 years of attending to things other people overlooked, the difference between a lie constructed under pressure and a true account delivered without performance. She had told him the story of that evening in the study with the flatness of a woman recounting what happened, not the careful emphasis of a woman constructing a defense. She had not told it in a way that made herself look well. She had not glossed over the moment of hesitation at the grate, or softened the Duchess's request into something more palatable. She had given him the unadorned sequence of events with the precision of someone who has always trusted the truth to be sufficient. The second detail was the Duke's letter. He had read it in the constable's anteroom with the morning light coming through the window, and the sentence about Edinburgh had rearranged itself before he had finished the page. He had known the Duke for 20 years. He knew how that man thought, how he laid plans with the patience of a chess player who was always 3 moves ahead of everyone else in the room, who had once told Callum, over port and a dying fire, that the only safe place to keep something important was inside someone you trusted absolutely. The Duke had trusted Nell with the location of the second proof. He had encoded it in a thank you letter, because he had known that Nell would keep a thank you letter, and because he had known she would read it the way she read everything, completely, with total retention, and that when the time came, she would know what it meant. He had also, Callum thought, known that the time would come. The solicitor in Edinburgh was named Hector Marsh, and he operated from a set of rooms on the 3rd floor of a building near the university, with the quiet, organized confidence of a man who had been keeping other people's secrets for 40 years and had no intention of stopping. He received Callum on the afternoon of his arrival with the wariness appropriate to an unannounced visit from a duke, and he listened to what Callum had to say with the stillness of a man who has been waiting for a conversation without knowing when it would arrive. When Callum finished, Marsh went to the cabinet in the corner of the room. He took out a document. He placed it on the desk between them. It was a certified copy of the essential provisions of the late Duke of Verne's private will, witnessed by Marsh himself and by the Duke's personal physician, dated 14 months prior, sealed with both their seals and registered in the Edinburgh court records in a way that made it entirely, irrevocably, legally binding. Callum looked at it for a long moment. Then he looked at Marsh, who looked back at him with the expression of a man who has done his job correctly and is satisfied by this. The copy named the daughter. It named the property in Northumberland and the income attached. It named the conditions under which the bequest was to be delivered. And it contained, in the final paragraph, a sentence that Callum read twice. The Duke had written that he was making this duplicate record because he did not trust the original to remain intact, and because his daughter deserved to know she was not forgotten. He had written that, if the original was destroyed, this copy was to take its full legal force. And he had written that the only person he trusted to know the location of this document, and to use that knowledge at the right moment, was Miss Eleanor Ashby, whose memory he relied on as he had relied on few things in his life. Nell had not known she was carrying that trust. She had read the letter as a kindness and kept it as a keepsake, and had gone to the fire when asked without knowing that the Duke had already accounted for the possibility that the fire might happen. He had planned for her. He had protected her, in his way, from the consequences of her own loyalty, by ensuring that what she burned was not the last of the proof. Callum folded the document inside his coat. He thanked Marsh. He walked back out into the Edinburgh afternoon with the cold coming in off the firth and the light going gray at the edges the way it did in November in the north. And he stood on the pavement for a moment and thought about a woman he had met through iron bars who had answered every question he asked without asking anything in return. He took the morning coach back south. The confrontation with Frey happened in the great hall of Verne Castle, which was not where Callum would have chosen to conduct it, but which was where Frey was when Callum arrived, presiding over the household inventory with the proprietary ease of a man who has decided the estate is already his. The room was occupied, the estate manager was present, and 2 of Frey's solicitors, and the housekeeper, and 3 footmen in the doorway. This was not ideal for Callum's purposes, and was entirely ideal for Nell's, because what was about to happen needed witnesses. He walked in and placed the certified copy on the table in front of Frey. He did not make a speech. He did not require one. He told Frey that he held a legally registered duplicate of the Duke of Verne's private will, certified by 2 witnesses and recorded with the Edinburgh court, which superseded any claim Frey had constructed on the assumption that the original was the only proof. He told Frey that the document named the Duke's daughter as heir to the Northumberland property, and that this inheritance was now on record in a jurisdiction Frey could not reach. He told Frey that the arrest of Miss Eleanor Ashby for destroying evidence was therefore predicated on a falsehood, that she had destroyed not the only proof but one instance of it, and that the destruction had in fact changed nothing legally, which Frey had known or should have known before making his accusation. Frey looked at the document. He looked at it for a long time. The room around him was very still, in the way rooms go still when a great deal of information is moving through them, and everyone in them is deciding, very quickly, which way the current is running. Then Frey looked up. What passed across his face in that moment was not guilt. It was the calculation of a man rapidly revising his position, assessing what could still be salvaged, what would have to be abandoned, how much of the story could be recast. He was still, even then, thinking 2 moves ahead. Callum looked at him and waited. He waited because he had learned, over 36 years of attending to things, that the moment a man's story collapses is not the dramatic instant of revelation, but the quieter, heavier moment just after it, when he has to decide who he is going to be in the wreckage of what he constructed. Frey chose badly. He opened his mouth to speak. The estate manager spoke first. He was a man named Dowd, who had served the Verne household for 30 years, and who had apparently been waiting, with the patience of the genuinely loyal, for an opportunity. He said, with the flat authority of someone who has decided to be honest, regardless of the cost, that he had been present when Baron Frey entered the study on the 3rd day, and that he had seen Frey open the locked drawer with a key that was not the key the Duchess kept on her chain, and that he had said nothing at the time because he had not known what it meant, and that he knew now. One of Frey's solicitors put his papers in his bag. The other one looked at the window. Frey said nothing further. The calculation behind his eyes ran its course and arrived at its conclusion, and the conclusion was that the room had turned, and he had lost it. He picked up his hat from the chair beside him. He walked to the door. The footmen in the doorway did not move to stop him, but they did not move aside either, and he had to turn sideways to pass between them, which was a small thing and also not a small thing at all. the constable was sent for. Callum went down to the dungeon. She heard his footsteps before she saw him, the same unhurried tread she had learned on the first morning, and she looked up from the bench when he came around the corner, and she watched his face, and she knew before he spoke. He told her she was free. He told her the copy existed, that the Duke had made it, that her burning of the original had changed nothing legally, and that Frey had known this or had taken a calculated risk on her not knowing it. He told her the estate manager had spoken. He told her Frey was in the constable's custody. He told her all of it, standing at the bars, not inside the cell, not with the door already open, because he was the kind of man who understood that information belonged to the person it most concerned and should be given to her before anything was decided. When he finished, she sat with it. She sat with it for longer than he had expected, he would tell her later. He had thought she might weep, or stand immediately, or ask a rapid sequence of follow-up questions in the manner he had come to associate with her mind. She did none of these things. She sat on the bench with her hands in her lap and her head slightly bowed, and she breathed, the way a person breathes when they are setting something down that they have been carrying for a very long time. Then she looked up. Her eyes were dry. Her back was straight. The ink stain on her right index finger caught the light from the grate above as she stood, and he looked at it because he had noticed it on the first morning and had thought about it since. The mark of a woman who had spent years writing other people's words and who deserved a great deal more than she had been given for it. The cell door opened. She walked out. The Duchess was waiting in the great hall. This was not something Callum had arranged. The Duchess had come of her own accord, which was, Nell would think later, the thing she had not dared to hope for. She had stood in a cell for 9 days and had not allowed herself to hope that the woman she had protected would come to face her, because hope of that kind was the most expensive kind there was. The Duchess stood at the far end of the hall. She was wearing black, which was correct for mourning, but which looked, in this moment, like something else. She looked at Nell with an expression that had nothing managed or composed about it. It was the face of a woman who had sat with what she had done for 9 days and had arrived at the end of those days in a particular and deserved state of reckoning. She crossed the hall. She stopped in front of Nell, and she looked at her, and what she said was not an explanation or a justification. She said, "I should have spoken. The moment they took you, I should have spoken, and I did not, and there is no account I can give of that which serves as anything other than what it was." Nell looked at her for a long time. She thought about the fire and the 9 seconds and the cold cell and 9 days on a bench with her own mind for company. She thought about the Duke, who had trusted her without telling her he was doing it, who had planned for her loyalty before she had demonstrated it. She thought about Thomas in the next cell, sharing his bread without asking questions, which had been, in its way, more generous than anything she had received from anyone with more to give. She did not say she forgave the Duchess, not yet. Some things take longer than a moment to arrive at, and she had learned not to offer what was not yet true. She said, "Tell me about her." The Duchess looked at her. "The daughter," Nell said. "Tell me about her. She is 21 years old and living in Yorkshire, and she is about to learn something that will change the shape of everything she knows. Someone should think about how that happens, and whether it is done well or badly. Someone should think about what she needs." The Duchess stood with this for a moment, and then something in her face changed, from the guilt that had brought her across the room to something older and more complicated. The grief of a woman who had made an impossible choice 20 years ago and had been living in the aftermath of it ever since. She began to talk. Callum withdrew to the far end of the hall, and stood at the window and looked out at the November grounds, the bare trees and the gray sky, and the long drive where Frey's carriage had stood and was no longer standing. He gave them the room. What followed was not swift, and it was not simple, and it did not arrange itself into the clean lines of a resolution. Real things rarely do. The legal proceedings against Frey took 4 months. Callum's solicitor and Marsh in Edinburgh managed the documentary case, and the estate manager Dowd gave his account with the unadorned precision of a man who had been waiting to tell the truth and found the telling lighter than the keeping. Frey's fraudulent claim on the estate collapsed with the thoroughness of structures that were never sound, leaving very little standing. The daughter, whose name was Anna, and who had been raised in a good household outside Harrogate, and who had spent 21 years being entirely herself without any knowledge of the complications that had attended her arrival in the world, received the news through a letter that Nell drafted and the Duchess signed. The drafting had taken 4 attempts, not because the facts were difficult to arrange, but because the facts needed to arrive in an order that was human rather than legal, and this was harder than it sounded. Anna's response came 3 weeks later, in a handwriting that slanted to the right in a way the Duchess recognized at once, and she had stood in the sitting room with the letter in her hands and wept in the way of a woman finally allowed to feel something she had been holding at a distance for a very long time. Nell was present for this. She had made herself useful again in the Verne household, not as a servant, but in the different capacity of a woman whose position was being renegotiated from the ground up, because the ground had shifted and the old terms no longer described what was true. She had also, in the weeks after her release, begun to write her own letters, not correspondence on behalf of someone else, her own. She wrote to a woman in Bristol who ran a small publishing concern that had been printing pamphlets on legal reform, and she offered her services as a writer because she had spent 3 years in a dungeon of other people's making, however briefly and however literally, and she had decided that the next thing she wrote would be in her own name and would say what she had worked out, in the cold, that she believed. Callum came to Verne Hall in December. He came in the afternoon, and Nell was in the library when he arrived, at the desk by the window where the light was best, with a stack of papers in front of her that were entirely her own. She had heard his carriage on the drive and had kept working, because she had learned in the past months that the arrival of a person worth meeting did not require you to stop being yourself in order to receive them. He came into the library and looked at the desk and the papers and the set of her shoulders over the work, and he pulled a chair from the reading table and sat down across from her and waited, with the patience she had come to associate with him, for her to reach a natural stopping point. She reached it. She put the pen down and looked at him. He had been coming to Verne Hall for 3 weeks, for reasons that had begun as professional and had gradually become something else, which neither of them had named yet with any precision, though both of them were aware of the shift in the way you are aware of a change in the weather before you can say exactly what is different about the air. He asked how the writing was going. She told him it was going the way first drafts always went, which was to say badly, but that badly was a necessary stage, and she had ceased to be frightened of it. He said he had read the first pamphlet she had published, which had come out the week before, through the Bristol concern under her own name. She looked at him. He said it was the clearest account of the legal position of women who destroyed evidence under compulsion that he had encountered in print, and that it had already been cited in a letter to the Lord Chancellor by someone whose opinion the Lord Chancellor was known to take seriously, and that he thought she should know this. She looked at him for a long moment. She thought about the first time she had seen him, through iron bars, in the cold, a man she had decided to trust, not from hope, but from logic, who had gone to Edinburgh and come back and opened a door she had not dared to expect. She thought about the Duke's letter and the encoded sentence and the trust placed in her memory before she knew it was there. She thought about 9 days on a bench learning what she was made of when everything else was taken away. She thought about the ink stain on her right finger, which had not faded. It would not fade. It was the mark of a woman who wrote things down, and she had decided to stop writing other people's things and start writing her own. And this was not a small decision, and it was entirely hers. She picked up the pen. She looked at him. She said, without looking away, that she appreciated him telling her, and that she intended to write 12 more. Something crossed his face at that. Not surprise, not its absence, something warmer than both. And he leaned back in the chair with the ease of a man who has found somewhere he intends to remain for a while. The afternoon light came through the library window and lay across the desk and across the papers and across her hand moving over the page. And the house was quiet around them in the way of a house that has been through something difficult and has come out the other side into a different, better order. She wrote. He stayed. This is what I want to leave you with. Not the courtroom victory, not Frey's comeuppance, not even the daughter in Yorkshire learning she was never forgotten. What I want to leave you with is this: a woman who came through 9 days of cold and injustice and came out the other side not diminished but clarified, who discovered, in the place where everything had been taken from her, what had always been hers and could not be taken: her memory, her name, her words. She had written other people's correspondence for 3 years. She wrote her own for the rest of her life. If this story stayed with you, if you have ever kept someone else's secret at a cost they never fully saw, then you know exactly what Nell Ashby carried into that cell and what she walked out holding. Subscribe to Dreamwalkers, a new story every week, and I would love for you to be here for it. Sleep well tonight. The ink stain on her right finger never did wash out. She stopped trying.